something slipped out of Russia that was never meant to be seen. 12 illegal photographs smuggled through layers of surveillance, cut straight through the government's polished facade. In one frame, $1 billion palace buried in silence. In another, frozen ghost towns that officials swear don't exist. Together, they expose a hidden Russia, one built on wealth, fear, and erasure. And what these images captured is far more terrifying than the state ever intended you to know.
The Black Sea Estate. The video was posted by Navalny's team 2 days after he was jailed upon returning to Russia. In early 2021, a video surfaced on YouTube with a force Russia never saw coming. Made by Alexei Navalny and his anti-corruption foundation, it dragged viewers straight into a world officials had spent years trying to seal off. The documentary ran nearly 2 hours, but its length only amplified its impact. Within a week, it passed 100 million views. Soon, it climbed beyond 130 million, becoming impossible to contain or discredit. At the heart of the investigation stood a massive private compound near the quiet village of Proskovka, close to the Black Sea shoreline by Galinzik. Putin was rich, or is rich, and despite social media discussions right now, as someone who has betrayed his country and wants to weaken Russia. Navalny's team estimated its construction and furnishing cost nearly 100 billion rubles, around $1.35 billion at the time. The residence alone covered more than 190,000 square feet, while the surrounding land formed a fortified stretch of restricted territory where ordinary access simply stopped. According to the Foundation's findings, the grounds held a church, an open-air theater, a greenhouse the size of a warehouse, vineyards, an ice training facility, and even a hidden tunnel carved through a cliff that led down to the water. Inside the main structure were marble pools, sculptures of ancient deities, and golden double-headed eagles glowing across the walls. The entire area operated under heavy security, flight restrictions and land boundaries locked off from the public. Navalny's team released nearly 500 photos showing the interior in striking detail. On paper, this billion-dollar estate belonged to a maze of shell companies, but using those leaked images and tracing financial networks, the Foundation argued the true owner was Putin himself, funded by a vast system of loyalist bribes. The Kremlin dismissed every claim as fiction, yet the photographs told a story far harder to wave away. They ignited large street protests across Russia, turning digital evidence into a real-world crisis. He was opposition leaders because he didn't have personal ambitions. In the weeks following the video's release, protests erupted in dozens of Russian cities. Thousands were detained for demanding answers about who funded the palace. The images showed more than a palace. They threatened an entire hierarchy of power, with the first protest of this magnitude in Russia in 6 years.
The city Russia tries to hide. There's a city near the edge of the Arctic that almost never appears in the news, a place where the air stings more than it sustains. Today, a tragic incident occurred in the southeast district of Moscow. This is Norilsk, a remote northern settlement in Russia where pollution reaches levels that feel unreal even when measured. Scientists have tracked it for years, and their data reveals the same grim truth. The yearly average concentration of sulfur dioxide rises far beyond any acceptable limit, sometimes reaching 10 to 30 times what experts call safe. Anyone who studies satellite images from NASA's Landsat program or Sentinel-2 sees the scars spreading across the terrain. Forests that once stood thick and dark now appear washed out and broken. A dead zone stretches for several thousand square miles, its vegetation weakened by acid rain and heavy metals settling into the soil. Within roughly 18 miles of the giant smelting plants, full-size trees have almost vanished. Instead, the ground is scattered with small, failing birch trees that look as if they are surrendering to the weight of the air around them. Norilsk began as a Soviet mining base and grew into one of the most industrialized locations in the far north. Gulag prisoners built the city in the 1930s and 1940s. Today, approximately 175,000 people remain, many because Norilsk nickel offers wages significantly higher than elsewhere in Russia to compensate for extreme conditions. The city became tightly linked to Norilsk Nickel, a massive producer of valuable metals. But the progress that built the region carried a heavy environmental cost for decades. Thick emissions from smelting rose into the sky and settled onto rivers and frozen ground, slowly breaking the balance of the surrounding ecosystems. Even the Dal-Dikan River shifts colors at times. Residents have watched it turn a deep red as nickel and copper compounds leak into the water from nearby industrial sites. The sight alarms the world whenever images surface, yet the cycle continues as long as production keeps driving forward.
What happened after Naval's death? In the cold weeks following the death of Russian opposition leader Alexei Navalny in February 2024, a silent battle played out on the streets. Mourners gathered at impromptu memorials where they held simple, printed portraits of the man who was Vladimir Putin's most prominent critic. Across the world, demonstrators mourned dead Russian opposition leader Alexei Navalny from the Russian embassy in Washington. In response, Russian authorities launched a systematic campaign. Officers selectively searched people in the crowds and pulled photographs of Navalny from coat pockets and bags. They took notes that bore his name. They did not just monitor the gatherings, they actively dismantled them by sweeping away flowers and portraits which were left at monuments dedicated to victims of political repression. People said the searches felt targeted. It was almost as if the aim was to erase any sign that he had meant something to those who came to honor him. The act of carrying his image became a direct offense. In Moscow, 2 men were arrested after police found photographs of Navalny in a backpack near a memorial. Across the nation, hundreds were detained simply for the crime of peaceful mourning. OVD Info, an independent monitoring group, documented over 400 detentions across Russia specifically for carrying Navalny's photograph or flowers. The crackdown extended to the press. One of the only remaining independent newspapers, Sobesednik, published an issue with Navalny's picture on the front page. Authorities responded by confiscating almost every copy from distribution points in the capital. This was not merely about maintaining order, it was an effort to control reality. When videos and photos of these confiscations reached the outside world, human rights groups like Amnesty International condemned the actions. When Putin was elected president, Navalny had moved successfully from the virtual world to the real world of protest. They called on the state to end what they labeled an insensitive campaign and to release those detained merely for wanting to remember. These scenes formed a stark visual record of a state so threatened by a photograph that it would deploy its power to seize it from its own citizens.
The frozen prisons Russia concealed. Hidden among old archives in Russia are photographs from prison camps scattered across the far reaches of Siberia, places the government tried to keep out of view for many years. These camps had been created in the early 1930s during Joseph Stalin's rule, and anyone who was accused of resisting the state could be forced into them. People from different backgrounds ended up there, including farmers, teachers, and anyone who said something that officials disliked. Many were sent to isolated regions where the cold cut through clothing and made each hour feel longer. Temperatures often dropped below 40 degrees Fahrenheit, and prisoners were pushed into mining, logging, and heavy construction. Historians later reviewed records released between 1989 and 1991, along with research from groups like Memorial, and they reached a staggering count. They concluded that around 18 to 20 million people had passed through the network of labor camps and colonies between the early 1930s and the mid-1950s. The system stretched across the Soviet Union, but the Siberian sites remained the most feared. Some camps became known by name long after they closed. Kolyma gained a dark reputation for its severe winters, while Vorkuta grew around a massive coal operation. Conservative estimates point to more than 1.5 million verified deaths during those years. Photographs from the camps were strictly forbidden. The few images that survived were smuggled out by released prisoners or taken secretly. These photos remained classified until the late 1980s. Life inside these places was shaped by hunger, sickness, and shelters that barely held together. Illness spread quickly since medical supplies were scarce. Other camps in Norilsk and along the old Salakard to Igara Railway, a route often called the Dead Road, saw some of the worst losses due to the cold. Officials managed to hide these realities for decades, but once survivors began sharing what they experienced, and once restricted photographs surfaced, the truth became harder to bury. Museums now stand where the camps once operated, and they try to guard the memory of those who endured conditions that few people today can imagine.